And we're continuing with the 6th chapter of The Letter, the Witch in the Ring by John Bellairs. Mrs. Zimmerman has been in the hospital and Rosarita has been exploring the town. Mrs. Zimmerman has discovered that it was not appendicitis that put her out, but a charm that was inside the dress that Rosarita thought she saw someone standing behind. And now Rosarita wants to know what they're going to do about it. I don't know, Rosarita. I just don't know. Somebody is after me, that much is clear. But who it is or why they're doing it, I just don't know. I have some ideas, but I'd rather not share them with you right now, if you don't mind. I've told you all this because I don't want you to feel guilty about driving off the road that night. You had every right to be scared. The thing you saw in the back seat, well, it wasn't in your head, it was real. Rosarita shuddered. What? What was it? I'd rather not say anything more right now, said Mrs. Zimmerman, but I will tell you this. We've got to get home, and we've got to get home fast. I've got to get a hold of my copy of Malus Maleficarum. The what? The Malus Maleficarum. It's a book that was written a long time ago by a monk. The title means Hammer of Witches. That is, the book is a weapon to use in fighting off attacks of those who fool around with black magic. It has a number of spells in it that will be of use to me. I should have memorized them long ago, but I didn't. So I need the book. And it's not the sort of thing you'd find at your friendly public library. We're going home first thing in the morning, and I ought to tell you why. I don't want to frighten you. I don't want to frighten you, but I figured you'd be frightened more if I went on being mysterious. Rosarita pointed to the strip of paper. What are you going to do with that? Watch, said Mrs. Zimmerman. She took a book of matches out of the drawer on the bedside table. She put the paper in an ashtray and lit it. While it burned, she made the sign of the cross over the ashtray and muttered a strange-sounding prayer. Rosarita watched, fascinated. She felt scared, but she felt excited, too, as if she had been suddenly swept out of her normal life and into an adventure. That evening, Rosarita helped Mrs. Zimmerman pack. She got her own things together, too. Mrs. Zimmerman informed her that Bessie was in the parking lot behind the hospital. A tow truck had pulled her up out of the juniper bushes, and the mechanics at the local garage had gone over her. She was all gassed and oiled and greased up and ready to roll. A nurse came in with some papers for Mrs. Zimmerman to sign. The doctor paid one more visit and said rather coldly that he hoped Mrs. Zimmerman had a good trip back. Everything was ready. Rosarita and Mrs. Zimmerman crawled into bed and tried to get some sleep. At first, Rosarita was too excited to sleep, but around midnight she drifted off. Then before she knew what was happening, she was awake again. Mrs. Zimmerman was standing by her bed. She was shaking her and shining a flashlight in her eyes. Come on, Rosarita, wake up, Mrs. Zimmerman said. Mrs. Zimmerman hissed. We've got to go, now. Rosarita shook her head and rubbed her eyes. She fumbled for her glasses and put them on. What? What's the matter? Wake up, I said. We're going to the farm, now, we've got to. Rosarita felt totally confused. The farm? But I thought you said... Never mind what I said. Get dressed and follow me. We're going back to the farm to get something I left there. Come on, you. Get a move on. She shook Rosarita roughly and flashed the light in her eyes. Rosarita had never seen Mrs. Zimmerman act this way before. Her voice was harsh. Her actions were rough and almost brutal. It was almost as if someone else had gotten inside of Mrs. Zimmerman's skin. And this business about going to the farm instead of going straight home the way they had planned, what did it mean? Rosarita dressed, and Mrs. Zimmerman stood there, stiff and still, behind the white glaring halo of the flashlight. Rosarita couldn't see her face, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to. When she was dressed, Rosarita grabbed her valise and followed Mrs. Zimmerman. They tiptoed to the door, opened it a crack, and peered down the long dark hall. At the far end, a nurse sat dozing behind a desk. An electric clock buzzed on the wall over her head. The whole hospital seemed to be asleep. Good, said Mrs. Zimmerman, and she led the way down the hall to a set of stairs. The stairs led to the parking lot behind the hospital. There in the moonlight sat Bessie, the green Plymouth, staring patiently ahead as always. Rosarita put the luggage in the trunk. Mrs. Zimmerman started the car, and they drove off. It was a long, hot, dusty ride all day across the length of the Upper Peninsula. For Rosarita, it was like a nightmare. Usually, Mrs. Zimmerman was fun to travel with. She laughed and joked and sang songs and talked a blue streak. When pestered, she even did little magic tricks, like snatching matches out of the air, or throwing her voice into the weeds at the side of the road. But now, as they rode along, she was silent. She seemed to be brooding about something. but she wouldn't tell Rosarita what it was, and Mrs. Zimmerman was nervous, very nervous. She glanced wildly from side to side, and sometimes got so jittery she almost drove off the road. Rosarita sat there rigid in her corner by the door, her sweaty hands at her sides. She didn't know what to do or what to say. The sun was going down over the straits of Mackinac as Bessie chugged into the parking lot of the ferryboat landing at St. Ignace. The boat had just left, and Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita had to wait a solid hour for the next one. They waited in silence, neither of them saying a word the whole time. Rosarita went out and bought some sandwiches. It was her own idea. Mrs. Zimmerman had not stopped for lunch. Finally, though, the boat came in. It was called the Grey Traverse Bay. The sky was dark and the moon was rising over the straits when Mrs. Zimmerman drove Bessie up the rattling gangplank and down into the black, echoing hold of the ship. When the car was parked and the chocks had been placed under the wheels, Rosarita started to get out. But then she discovered Mrs. Zimmerman was just sitting there, motionless behind the wheel. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Rosarita called nervously, "aren't you coming up?" Mrs. Zimmerman gave a little start and shook her head. She stared at Rosarita as if she had never seen her before. "Oh, come up. Yes, of course. Be right with you." She got out of the car like a sleepwalker, clumped up the steps to the deck. It ought to have been a very beautiful crossing. The moon shone down, silvering the decks with the ripply water of the straits. Rosarita tried to get Mrs. Zimmerman to walk around with her on the deck, but she wouldn't do it. She sat rigid on a bench and stared at her shoes. Rosarita was frightened. This wasn't an adventure anymore. She wished with all her heart that they had never come on this trip. She wished they were back home in New Zebedee. Maybe if they were home, Uncle Jonathan or Doc Humphreys or somebody could figure out what was wrong with Mrs. Zimmerman and make her act like her old self again. Rosarita didn't feel as if she could do anything for Mrs. Zimmerman. She felt utterly hopeless. All she could do was tag along and wait. An hour or so later, Mrs. Zimmerman and Rosarita were driving down the gravel road that led to Ole Gunderson's farm. They passed Gert Bigger's store and saw that it was closed. A tiny nightlight burned on the porch. Rosarita couldn't stand it any longer. "Mrs. Zimmerman," she burst out, "why are we going to the farm? What's this all about?" At first, Mrs. Zimmerman was silent. Then she said in a slow, dull voice, "I don't know why. There's something I have to do there, but I can't remember what it is." They drove on. Gravel cracked and popped under the car's tires, and sometimes long leafy branches whipped across the doors or the roof. Now it began to rain. Big drops started to splat on the windshield, and Rosarita heard the dull rolling of thunder. Flashes of lightning leaped out in front of the car. Now they were at the farm. As they drove into the yard, a bright flash lit up the front of the barn, showing the two staring window eyes and the yawning mouth of the door. It was like a monster mouth opening to swallow them up. Because it was raining outside, Rosarita and Mrs. Zimmerman went into the house by way of the long covered walkway that ran from the house to the barn. But when they unlocked the door and tried to turn the lights on, nothing happened. Mrs. Zimmerman had forgotten to pay Ole's overdue electric bill, and the current had been shut off since their first visit. After digging around the cupboard, Mrs. Zimmerman found a kerosene lamp. She lit it and put it on the kitchen table. Rosarita opened up the picnic hamper, and they sat down to eat the sandwiches Rosarita had bought. They ate in silence. In the smoky yellow light, Mrs. Zimmerman's face looked haggard and worn. She also looked tense, very tense, as if she were waiting for something to happen. Rosarita looked nervously over her shoulder. Beyond the circle of friendly lamplight, the house lay in shadow. The staircase was a well of darkness. Rosarita realized with a sudden sick feeling that she would have to go up those stairs to bed. She didn't want to go to bed. She didn't want to stay in Ole's house for another minute. She wanted to bundle Mrs. Zimmerman into the car and make her drive them back to New Zebedee, even if they had to drive all night. But Rosarita didn't say anything. She made no move. Whatever the spell was that lay over Mrs. Zimmerman, it lay over Rosarita too. She felt utterly powerless. Outside it was pouring. There was a tin roof on the front porch, and the sound of the rain hitting it was a steady drumming roar. Finally, with an effort, Rosarita pushed back her chair. She stood up. "I think we ought to go to bed, Mrs. Zimmerman," she said hoarsely. Her voice was faint and seemed to be coming from deep down inside her. You go on, Rosarita. I want to sit here and think a bit. Mrs. Zimmerman's voice was wooden and mechanical and unbelievably weary. It almost sounded as if she were talking in her sleep. Rosarita backed away fearfully. She picked up her valise, took out her flashlight, and turned toward the stairs. As Rosarita went up the steps, flashlight in hand, her shadow and the shadow of the railing danced weirdly on the wall next to her. Halfway up, Rosarita stopped and looked down. There sat Mrs. Zimmerman in the circle of yellow lamplight. Her hands were folded on the table, and she was staring straight ahead of her. Rosarita had a feeling that if she called to her, she wouldn't get any answer. She swallowed hard and went up the stairs. The bedroom with the black walnut bed was just as Rosarita had left it. She began to peel back the spread, but halfway she stopped. She stopped because she had heard a noise from downstairs, a single small noise, tap, the sound of Mrs. Zimmerman's ring. Now the sound was repeated 3 times over. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was slow and mechanical, like the ticking of a big clock. Rosarita stood there, flashlight in hand. She listened to the sound and wondered what it meant. Suddenly a door slammed. Rosarita gave a little yelp and spun around. She dashed out of the room and down the stairs. On the landing she froze. There was the table with the lamp burning on it. There was Mrs. Zimmerman's purse and her cigar case. The front door was open. It banged gently in the wind. Mrs. Zimmerman was gone. And that's the end of chapter 6.